Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the propaganda that's doing the rounds, and even Disney and other infotainment and globalist controlled outlets are pushing this idea that it was blacks who built America. It wasn't a white person inside. And any white person who was around was only Hitler anyway, so it didn't do any work. But this attitude that America had black slaves, therefore blacks built America. I mean, hey, logic. So such strangle logic and such idiocy and such a moronic take on history is being used, along with many other things. The 1619 Project and all this hysterical nonsense, which beautifully dovetails in with the globalist project. The big losers from globalization are the white people of the West. And they're the people that are questioning globalization or opposing it. So the globalists are a full-on assault on white society, or non-elite white society. They're Nazis, they're racists, they're fascists, they're Hitler, and doing everything they can to crush that society and detach it from its past. So all the history is bad and everything white people did is evil and so on. And that's simply to serve the purpose of the globalist project and nothing else. So it's quite absurd. But given that the globalists own all the Western governments now, pretty much the entire body politic, they control 90%. 95% of the media landscape, then they can get away with this utter nonsense because they're just not being called out. But like any true ideological fanatical bureaucrats, they want 100% total control, not one dissenting voice. And as long as there's a single white voice that questions or doubts or opposes the globalist project, then the massive crushing propaganda campaign must continue until white people are completely crushed or eradicated or replaced, and the globalists don't care which. Any one of those three will do. Ideological total control is their objective. Collateral damage is irrelevant. So this slavery reparations is all part of this crush white society shtick that they're on about. But let's look at it on a factual basis. Now, slavery was being practiced by all the colonial players of the day: the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British, of course, and anyone else is on the game now. Also, the South American, the Aztecs, the Incas, all those guys, they practiced slavery. It was widespread there. The North American Indians were very big into the slavery stuff as well. So really the idea that it was a uniquely white thing in that era is quite absurd. And similarly, all the slaves that came to the Americas were captured at first by other blacks, or in some cases Arab slavers, but primarily by other blacks. So and the main source of wealth to those African sort of princes and kings and petty chieftains, that sort of stuff. The main source of wealth was selling their fellow countrymen into slavery in return for gold or Western goods and so on. So manufactured goods and so on. And given that the blacks were primarily Stone Age people, even the early manufactured goods, even by artisans and that sort of thing, this is before the Industrial Revolution, even those sort of goods were valued by the African kings. They'd never seen anything like that in their own areas and their own economies. So they it was the blacks catching or capturing and imprisoning other blacks. It wasn't the whites doing it. Nonetheless, so the black slaves are brought over to the Americas. Now, the primary reason was just simply the availability of labour. Like Portugal had acquired Brazil in South America, but the population of Portugal at the time was less than 300,000. So, or the male population at least. So they had no choice. If they were going to some of the land was quite good for cultivating and having plantation, sugar cane, and so on. So if they wanted labourers to work there, then the only source of labour that could do the heavy work was resistant to the local diseases and to European diseases. The only people who could do that were the black people. So they were the only source of labour. Now, if they had another source of labour, they would have gone there, because it's not cheap to send fully crewed ships, to West, in this case, West Africa. And then purchase the slaves, then transport them across. Now they have to be ready for work at the other end. This idea that they all arrived emaciated and nearly all of them died doing that's nonsense. They've paid big bucks for the slaves, and the people at the other end want people that are fit, healthy, and ready to work. So they have to survive the voyage and be in good condition when they get there. So when the slaves were brought over, and again, this is a labour thing, and slavery's been, every race in existence has practiced slavery, some still do today. Again, the main areas that practice slavery today is still in Africa, interestingly. So the slaves arrive now, the plantation owners, because it's primarily in the south where the bigger plantations are, things like cotton and so on. Or broad acreage, because if it's small acreage, slavery tends not to work as an economic sort of thing there. It has to be broad acre type farms, so large plantations. And again, for example, cotton and so on. Now, the reason cotton is it's quite labour intensive to plant and to pick. And even technological developments in cotton, like the cotton gin, to separate the cotton seeds from the fibres, which was always a painstaking task. When that came in, that allowed more efficiencies to come into cotton farming, which in turn created larger plantations to handle cotton, which in turn created a bigger demand for slaves. Now, because slaves were so expensive to transport, again, it was something, if they could have avoided it, they would. It was done because there was no other option. So the slaves were brought over, and they were expensive to bring over, expensive to buy. So, I mean, in today's money, we're talking like $50,000 for a healthy and fit slave. So there was much encouragement to promote local procreation, even though you've got sort of like you've got to wait till the child grows up into at least early adulthood and that sort of stuff before they can really do any work. But or maybe they help around the house when they're younger. But effectively, to go out and do the heavy work in the plantation under the sun, they need to be a certain age and certain fitness. So but it was still, and if you look at the writings of the time, it was still far more economical to promote local procreation than it was to bring slaves over. So again, the idea of transporting slaves was a last resort, and it was seen as being an unavoidable necessity if they were going to bring that much acreage under cultivation. Now, the local Indians were tried, but they were very, very susceptible to European diseases, and they weren't used to the sort of work that were really incapable to the same degree, at least, that the black labourers were. The white people didn't fare too well with particularly in the south of the United States, particularly in summer, didn't fare too well sort of doing that agricultural work and the heavy work. So and were susceptible to diseases that were local to the US, whereas the blacks were resistant to it. So there's other factors involved there as to why black people were being used, or uniquely in most cases. Now, not all black people in the United States were slaves. Up in the northeast, there was freed black people. Not a whole lot, but they were there. Also in Canada. Now, the British sort of ended slavery as much as a moral thing as it was for an economic thing. The British were industrializing and wanted to slaves were really a cheap labor competitor to mechanization of industry, such as the spinning jenny for fabrics and things like that, cotton fabrics. So there was that was an issue as well. But did the blacks build America? So that's the issue. So if we look at the amount of the US economy that was tied up, or even before the War of Independence, if we look at the amount of the US economy that was even up until the Civil War that was tied up to uh, you know the areas of the economy where slaves were heavily present, which was, again, things like cotton farming or any broadacre farming in the South, really. In the if we look at, say, the wheat that was being, the large wheat fields and those sort of things, that was more out in the Midwest and heading out towards California, that sort of thing. And that was where these broadacre, say, cereal crops. There were very few slaves involved in that, and in some of those states, a lot of those states, in fact, the newer states, slavery wasn't. Slavery was not permitted in those states. So in those broadacre farms, where a degree of mechanization and efficiency of labour was an issue, and where there was a need for higher intellectual sort of property type input, then slaves weren't involved in that, or very rarely, and so it was still in the very repetitive work, labour intensive things like picking cotton and that sort of stuff. That's where slavery was still viable. We look at the total amount of the economy that was, say, related to cotton and that sort of stuff. It was less than 10% of the US economy in say the late 1850s. So it was not a big factor economically. So if we're going to say the slaves built America, then if we just look at the slave states in isolation and we look at the proportion of the total economy that the slave states had that was dependent on slaves, again, for example, cotton, then we see it's a very small proportion of the total economy. So this idea that slaves built America is false and quite ridiculous in the extreme. It just isn't true. Did they play a role in, for example, the textiles like cotton? And I said, well, of course, I don't think there's any disputing that. But the nature of the economy in those agricultural areas was they were growing their own, produce. The slave owners were housing and clothing and feeding these people. When you're looking at reparations, do you say, well, here's the amount of money that the cotton plantations were making. Here's what the cost of maintaining the slaves were. Therefore, we deduct this from that, and how much is left over. We leave a nominal profit for a business owner, which would be acceptable today. This is the person that's invested in bought the land, invested in the seeds and the crops, and has paid for all the irrigation canals and ditches, and has paid for all the machinery, all the horses and the oxen. They're all paid for by the farmer or the plantation owner. So if we take all the cost of running the business, look at the profit, and then look at a wage for somebody, say a wage for a white man at the time, what they'd be paid, and then deduct the feeding and the housing and the clothing and so on, then you're looking at a situation where there wouldn't be a whole lot left over. So those reparations would be, it'd be a pretty small check. Then we'd have to go back to things like, well, was this worker a productive worker? Were they just part of a work crew? Maybe they stood there holding the horse reins or something. Then you'd need to go down to that level of detail. Now, any work that involved, nearly every supervisor or overseer or whatever, even where you had black plantation owners, and I think 2 or 3% of the plantations were owned by black plantation owners. They would only hire white supervisors and overseers. I think you really struggle to find even a single black plantation owner that owns that employs a black supervisor or overseer. So as soon as the farming became more technical and more knowledge intensive, then the amount of slaves involved declined rapidly. Now, this would suggest that the slave workers were doing the most basic of the basic labouring tasks. Now, some people point out to, well, hey, that can't be right, because there were slaves that were taught to play the violin in the big white mansions and the households there. So that proves that slaves were really knowledge intensive workers. No, I completely reject that. There's hardly any of those anyway, and you can't say that playing the violin is entitles someone uniquely to a generous sort of set of reparations. Again, given that they were clothed, housed, and fed by the plantation owner. Now, let's take a white sort of farmer operating anywhere in Western Europe or in Britain, for that matter. There'd be a few things they would the aristocrat or the landowner would give them a house, would provide them with fabric, which they'd have to sew up themselves, would provide them with wood, cutting tools to make tables and chairs and this sort of thing, and they would be either allocated a plot of land where they could grow their own food, or they would work on a more communal type farm, and they would be allowed to keep a certain proportion of that produce for themselves and their family and so on. So, and then whatever surplus they grew on the plot of land they were allocated, they would then barter and trade with other small landholders or other what would you call them, feudal serfs, I guess. And they would then, it would be a bartering economy, which is the same that the black slaves were doing in their own plots of land. They would be bartering and so on. So their quality of life, in terms of the food and that they didn't have to meet money costs and that sort of thing, nor did the landowners to any extent. So much of the economy was barter and exchange. The only time money came into it was with things like when the farmers would say be selling their cotton bales to the overseas purchasers, which at the time was primarily the British, because they'd mechanized first and had an extremely efficient mechanized textile industry, so they're mainly selling it there. And also, I mean, just to sort of in India, where again the labour, so there was slavery there, and this is before the British had taken over. A lot of cotton was being grown in India, and they had slavery there. But the plantation system in the US was still more efficient than the Indian system, even though that both were using slaves. There's also an issue of distance. It's the east coast of America was closer to the British factories than it was transporting stuff from India. So there's a transport cost issue as well. But it's hard to find anywhere where you can say, well, the blacks build. Did blacks build the legal structure? Did they build the contracts? Did they design and conceive the all the drainage and all the farming infrastructure? Did they invent the horses? Did they invent all the technology? And did they have any concept of any of these things? Did they have to be taught them? Should the white teachers and trainers of these people be recompensed for training these people? In the event that some of the black people were used, say, they were like apprenticed to, say, carpenters and that sort of thing. Should they pay back the people that trained them? The white carpenters that trained them to become carpenters. How does that work? So as the more you dive into it, these completely unskilled, illiterate labourers arrived, and yet we're to believe that they built America. Now, did their labour, as in their basic, entry level of the entry level of the labour, because remember they're illiterate, and so they've got to be showing pick this cotton, this is how you do it. So it's a show and tell thing. That is the primary wealth generator of the economy. Well, of course it's not. That's quite absurd. So the whole idea that blacks build America in any sense, whether it be economically, legally, physically, and it is quite ridiculous. That they were labourers and played a role in certain sectors of the economy, in certain areas of the country. Well, that's for sure. There's no denying that. But again, once you start delving into the on costs of housing, clothing, feeding, and all that sort of stuff, and the bartering, and they've got their own land to grow food and can barter that around with others. You look at that in totality, suddenly there's not much left. I mean, let's look at a basic entry level labouring job today in any decent sized city. Again, we're talking just basic entry level labouring, and then you deduct from it the cost of a commercial rent, the cost of food. Now, it's not possible to say pay rent on your own place on an entry level wage, a labouring wage, certainly not in any big city that I'm aware of. So you'd have to live communally, and you'd have to live at least 3 people to say a compact 2-bedroom apartment. Now then you look at the cost of commercial, buying of food and we'll assume transport's not an issue because you're sort of staying on the plantation, but you look at the costs of clothing and energy and so on. Remember, the farmer's providing, or the plantation is providing the candles and all the other bits. If you want to learn to read the Bible, that they'll teach you. So the education to a point's being offered. So these are, if you look at that cost of living and you deduct that from the wage of an entry-level labourer today, there's nothing left over. So as the farmer or the plantation was providing accommodation and food and clothing and furniture and so on, if you actually took the value of that and deducted it from an entry-level labourer's wage, then the farmer the plantation owner was really providing all of these things in return, which was the equivalent, if not more valuable than the wage would have been. So we see that today. The peasants that have been brought in from rural India and China and elsewhere around Asia to Australia, usually under immigration scams of all sorts. They're brought in and they're put up, 17 to a 1-bedroom apartment, and it's mattresses on the floor, bunk beds in rotation, all this sort of thing, and they're given shit jobs, and they're fed, housed. They're usually their Indian employer pays them a few bucks, but they're all transport, everything's taken care of, and they're given a few bucks sort of spending money. But for the job they're doing, that's a rough equivalent. So even today in the Western world, we've got slavery going on. It's happening big time in the United States. All the Mexicans and South American peasants that are coming in, things like that. The people smoke. There's a slavery people smuggling racket of huge proportions going across the whole Western world, of illiterate peasants being brought in under exactly these same conditions. Why aren't we screaming about that? But apparently that's all fine. So if you look at the contribution that blacks have made of the lowest entry level labourers, and then the compensation they received in things like accommodation and food, then I would argue that they're roughly equivalent. And we can see it today that an entry level labourer's wage is barely enough to exist, even with communal living and living a modest lifestyle of having no social life. You're not being able to go out, and those people can't even afford to sort of sit down, have a takeout fast food meal, that their budget will be that tight. And even today with entry-level labourers. So I would dismiss entirely this argument that slaves built America or there's any compensation due. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.